Ryan Keller stood outside one of his own fast food locations, adjusting the name tag on his uniform. Trainee Jake. His reflection in the glass showed a man far from his usual clean-cut executive look. His dark brown hair was now buzzed short, and he wore thick, rimmed glasses that changed the shape of his face. He had spent years building this business from the ground up, expanding to 8 locations, but lately, customer complaints and employee turnover had skyrocketed at this particular store. His district manager swore things were fine, but Ryan needed to see for himself. He pushed through the doors, greeted by the scent of fryer oil and the steady hum of customer chatter. A teenager at the register struggled to ring up a large order while the kitchen workers rushed to keep up. The place was clearly understaffed, but no one seemed surprised by it. "Hey, you the new guy," a voice barked from behind. Ryan turned to see a man in his early 40s wearing a manager's badge, Chris store manager. His blonde hair was slicked back and his expression was all business. "Yeah, first day," Ryan said, keeping his voice casual. Chris barely acknowledged him. "Great, we don't have time for slow learners, follow me." Ryan trailed him to the back where a young woman, probably in her early 20s, was struggling to assemble a burger order while keeping pace with the drive-thru. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she grabbed the wrong sauce and quickly corrected herself. Chris clapped his hands loudly. "Serena." "You moving in slow motion or what?" Serena flinched but kept working. "I'm going as fast as I can, sir," Chris scoffed. "Yeah, well, if this is your best, I'd hate to see your worst. Maybe you belong flipping burgers in your backyard, not in a real restaurant." Ryan's jaw tightened. He had seen enough, but not yet. He needed to observe more to understand what was really going on in this store. Chris turned back to Ryan. "You, watch her. If you work at half her speed, you won't last the week." Serena kept her eyes down, but Ryan saw the way her hands trembled as she wrapped the next burger. He had to bite back his anger. He had been in her shoes once working the line, feeling the pressure. No one deserved to be humiliated at work, especially by their own boss. Ryan forced himself to stay quiet. He needed to see how deep this problem went before he revealed who he really was. His undercover shift had just begun. Ryan kept his head down and worked, watching everything. The kitchen was chaotic, not because of the employees, but because of how poorly everything was managed. Orders piled up on the screen faster than they could be completed. The fry station was a mess, with baskets of overcooked potatoes sitting out too long. The prep table was cluttered with half-used ingredients, making it hard to move efficiently. Serena barely had a moment to breathe. Every time she tried to catch up, another order came in. Her hands moved quickly, but it was clear she was overwhelmed. When she reached for a fresh bun, Chris suddenly stepped in and grabbed it from her. "Try keeping up for once," he said. "I swear you work like you're half asleep." Ryan watched Serena's expression tighten, but she didn't argue. She just kept working faster now, even though it was obvious she was already doing her best. Chris turned his attention to Ryan. "You, grab those patties and don't screw up the placement. I don't have time to baby new hires." Ryan did as he was told, his mind racing. He had spent years building this company, making sure employees felt respected. Yet here was one of his managers tearing down the very people who kept this place running. A man in his early 30s worked the grill station beside him, flipping patties with practiced ease. He glanced at Ryan, then at Serena, shaking his head slightly. "She's been here a while," he said under his breath. "Works harder than anyone." Ryan kept his voice low. "Chris always like this?" The man gave a short nod. "Worse when corporate isn't looking." Ryan didn't respond, processing the information. He had picked this location because complaints had increased, but now he was seeing firsthand what the reports hadn't captured. A rush of customers came through the drive-thru, and Chris started barking orders again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Ryan, no, Jake, whatever, move faster. This isn't a retirement home." Ryan clenched his jaw but kept his tone neutral. "Got it." Chris didn't seem to notice anything off about him, which was good. He needed more time. As the lunch rush continued, Ryan saw another issue: there weren't enough people on shift. The team was stretched thin, and Chris wasn't stepping in to help. He just stood near the monitors, criticizing every small mistake. Serena wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, her breathing uneven. "Can I grab some water real quick?" Chris barely looked at her. After the rush, Ryan checked the clock. They had been going non-stop for over 2 hours. No breaks, that wasn't company policy. Serena didn't argue, just kept working. Ryan knew exhaustion when he saw it. Her hands were moving slower now, her coordination slipping. Then it happened. She reached for a sauce container and knocked over a tray of lettuce. It spilled onto the floor. Chris was on her in an instant. "Are you kidding me? Do you even have basic motor skills?" Serena's face flushed, and for the first time she hesitated before picking up the mess. Ryan had seen enough. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't blow his cover yet, but he wasn't about to let this continue. He stepped forward and grabbed a broom. "I'll clean it up." Chris turned to him, scowling. "She made the mess, she cleans it." Ryan didn't back down. "She's keeping up with orders. If she stops, we'll fall behind." Chris narrowed his eyes. "You don't tell me how to run my store." Ryan met his gaze evenly. "Just trying to help." Chris scoffed but didn't push it further. Ryan quickly cleaned up the mess while Serena focused on the orders. As the rush finally died down, Serena took a shaky breath. "Thanks." Ryan gave a small nod. "You okay?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Just another day." Ryan felt something tighten in his chest. That shouldn't be normal. Chris walked past, muttering to himself. "Useless employees." Ryan's hands curled into fists at his sides. He was done watching. It was time to act. Ryan had seen enough. The way Chris ran this store wasn't just inefficient, it was toxic. Employees were overworked, mistreated, and given no support. It was the opposite of the culture he had built in his company. If this was happening here, how many other locations were suffering under managers like Chris? He stepped away from the kitchen and into the back office, where Chris sat at the desk, scrolling through his phone. The contrast was stark. His employees were running themselves ragged, and he was doing nothing to help. Ryan had spent the entire shift watching him berate his workers, and now he wasn't even pretending to be busy. Ryan knocked on the doorframe, keeping his voice level. "Hey, got a minute?" Chris barely looked up. "What?" Ryan stepped inside and shut the door behind him. He took off his glasses and ran a hand through his hair, the disguise no longer necessary. "Let's talk." Chris narrowed his eyes for the first time, really looking at him. There was a flicker of confusion, then something close to recognition. "Wait, who?" Ryan cut him off. "Ryan Keller, owner of this company." Chris's face drained of color. He sat up straighter, his phone slipping from his hand onto the desk. Ryan didn't give him a chance to recover. "I've been working your shift all day. Watching how you treat your team. Watching how you don't step in when they need help. Watching you humiliate and degrade people who are doing their best in a system you've set up to fail." Chris opened his mouth, but Ryan wasn't finished. "I built this company on respect, on teamwork, on valuing every employee from the ground up, and what I saw today, that's not leadership." Chris swallowed hard. "Listen, Ryan held up a hand. "I don't want excuses. I want to know why you think this is acceptable." Chris hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. "It's a fast food job. If they can't handle it, they don't belong here." Ryan's eyes hardened. "That's your answer?" Chris shrugged, trying to regain some control. "Look, I push them because I have to. Corporate's always on me about numbers, and if they can't keep up, that's not my fault." Ryan leaned forward slightly. "You think this has anything to do with speed? You refuse to give breaks. You let the store run understaffed. You mock the very people keeping this place running, and instead of leading, you stand back and criticize." Chris's jaw tightened. "They need to toughen up. This isn't some charity." Ryan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. "You think leadership is about breaking people. Let me tell you something, this business doesn't survive without the people on that floor, and you've driven them into the ground." Chris shifted in his chair, his confidence cracking. "I get results." Ryan's voice was cold now. "No, you get fear." And that's not how we operate. Chris opened his mouth again, but Ryan had already made his decision. Effective immediately, you're done here. Chris's face went red. You can't just— Ryan cut him off again. I can and I am. I won't have someone like you representing my company. Chris stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You think firing me is going to fix anything? Good luck finding someone else to run this place. Ryan didn't waver. I'd rather have no manager than one who destroys the people under him. Chris scoffed, shaking his head, but the bravado had drained from his eyes. He grabbed his things and stormed past Ryan, shoving open the office door. Ryan followed him back into the main area. The employees had noticed the confrontation, the tension thick in the air. When Chris exited without a word, eyes darted between Ryan and the now empty space where their manager had stood. Ryan stepped forward and faced the team. He saw the exhaustion in their faces, the uncertainty. But most of all, he saw the relief. He took a deep breath. I know you all just saw what happened. Chris is no longer with this company. A few stunned glances were exchanged, but no one spoke. Ryan continued, I've been here all day. I've seen how hard you work. How much you care about doing a good job despite the conditions you've been put in. That ends now. Serena, hesitant, finally found her voice. What happens next? Ryan met her gaze. Things change. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Ryan turned to the rest of the staff. For now, I'll be overseeing operations personally until we find the right leadership. Breaks will be reinstated. Scheduling will be fixed. And most importantly, respect will be the foundation of this store again. A murmur moved through the group, softer than before, hopeful. Ryan glanced at Serena. You've been holding this place together. You shouldn't have to. She looked down for a moment, then back up, something unreadable in her eyes. Thank you, Ryan nodded. Go take your break, you've earned it. She hesitated, almost as if she didn't believe she was allowed to, but then she nodded and stepped away. Ryan turned back to the rest of the team. Let's get this place back on track. And for the first time that day, the weight in the air lifted. Ryan stayed in the store long after Chris left. The employees still moved cautiously, some exchanging uncertain glances as if waiting for another outburst, another reprimand. He knew that kind of tension didn't disappear overnight. It had been ingrained in them, reinforced day after day. Undoing that damage would take time. He stepped behind the counter, rolling up his sleeves. They needed more than words, they needed action. Without hesitation, he grabbed a pair of gloves and started assembling orders alongside them. The kitchen was still understaffed, and if they were going to get through the dinner rush, they needed all hands on deck. The man working the grill, the one who had quietly acknowledged Serena's hard work earlier, glanced at him. You don't have to do that, he said. Ryan didn't stop moving. Neither do you, not alone anyway. The man pressed a fresh patty onto the grill, considering that for a moment. Then, with a small nod, he focused back on the food. Serena returned from her break a few minutes later, her posture slightly looser than before. But when she saw Ryan working, her steps slowed. You're actually helping. Ryan placed a bun on the wrapper, added the toppings, and passed it down the line. That a problem? She shook her head, but there was something like disbelief in her expression. Just not what I expected. Ryan kept his focus on the task at hand. You've been running this place short-staffed for too long. That changes now. Serena hesitated, then stepped back into her station, moving more steadily than before. The next few hours were a test of endurance. The dinner rush hit hard, but with Ryan jumping in where needed, the team found a rhythm. He noticed small things, how Serena adjusted the way she stacked ingredients to make the process smoother, how the grill worker timed the patties perfectly, how the cashier subtly reworded his greetings to make customers feel more welcome. They weren't the problem. They never had been. As the last few orders of the night went out, Ryan finally stepped back, stretching his arms. The tension in the air had shifted. It wasn't completely gone, but it was lighter. One of the younger employees, barely out of high school, wiped down the counter and glanced at him. You really own the company, Ryan nodded. The kid exhaled, shaking his head. I thought you were just some guy. Ryan gave a short, tired laugh. I am, just one who needed to see the truth for himself. Serena leaned against the prep table, arms crossed. So what happens now? Ryan pulled off his gloves, tossing them into the trash. New management, someone who actually values the people here. The grill worker wiped his hands on his apron. You think that'll fix everything? Ryan met his gaze. Not overnight. But it's a start. The man considered that, then gave a short nod. Ryan turned back to Serena. You've been keeping this place together. I don't need to tell you that, but I want to make sure you're not carrying it alone anymore. She studied him for a long moment, then looked away. I just wanted to do my job without feeling like garbage every day. Ryan's expression hardened. That should have never been a problem to begin with. She let out a slow breath, then straightened. Guess we'll see if things actually change. Ryan nodded. You will. By closing time, the employees moved with less hesitation, not relaxed, not completely trusting, but there was something different in the way they carried themselves, a cautious hope. As they locked up for the night, Ryan stood by the door, watching them head out. This wasn't just about one store. If Chris had been running things this way for months, it meant deeper cracks in the system. It wasn't enough to fix this one location, he needed to make sure it wasn't happening anywhere else. He had built this company from the ground up. He wasn't about to let it rot from the inside. Ryan pulled out his phone and started making calls. This was just the beginning. Ryan sat in his car outside the restaurant long after the employees had gone home. His phone screen glowed in the dark interior, filled with emails and messages from his corporate team. Word had spread fast about what had happened at the store, and now his leadership team was scrambling for answers. The district manager, Mark, had sent multiple messages, all variations of the same question: why hadn't he been informed of these issues sooner? Ryan wasn't sure which answer would be worse, that Mark had genuinely been unaware, or that he had known and done nothing. He tapped out a message, short and direct. We need to talk first thing tomorrow. In person. The next morning, Ryan walked into the corporate office, a stark contrast to the restaurant's chaotic energy. Here, everything was polished, clean desks, quiet hallways, employees focused on spreadsheets instead of sizzling grills and buzzing order screens. It was a world removed from the one he had stepped into yesterday, and that disconnect had never been more obvious. Mark was already waiting in the conference room, his laptop open, a notepad beside him. He was in his early 50s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of polished demeanor that came from years of managing people from a distance. As Ryan sat down, Mark leaned forward, his expression controlled but tense. I heard what happened, Mark started. Firing Chris on the spot, was that really necessary? Ryan didn't blink. You tell me. How long has that store been running like that? Mark hesitated, then flipped open his notepad. I had complaints, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. Every location has staffing issues, occasional morale problems. Ryan cut him off. That wasn't a morale problem. That was a manager who created a toxic environment and let his staff burn out. You should have caught it. Mark exhaled sharply, setting his pen down. I rely on reports from my managers. If Chris wasn't honest about what was happening, how was I supposed to know? Ryan studied him. You never visited? Mark shifted in his seat. I did, but when a manager knows corporate is coming, things tend to look different. That was exactly the problem. Ryan had walked in as a trainee and seen everything within a few hours. Mark had been overseeing the store for years and hadn't. Ryan leaned forward. That's not good enough. If visiting a store doesn't give you the real picture, then we need a better way to see what's actually happening. Mark was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. What are you thinking? Ryan pulled up the notes he had taken on his phone. First, every location is getting an internal audit. I don't want reports from managers, I want direct feedback from employees. Anonymous, so they don't have to worry about backlash. Mark jotted it down. And after that, Ryan's voice was firm. We overhaul how we train managers. Leadership isn't just about hitting numbers. It's about knowing how to support a team, how to lead without tearing people down. Mark rubbed his jaw, considering. That's a big shift. Ryan didn't waver. So was building this company. And I won't let it become the kind of place I'd never want to work in myself. Mark nodded, his skepticism fading. I'll start pulling data on locations with high turnover and complaints. That should give us a starting point. Ryan stood. Good. Because this doesn't stop with one store. By the time he left the office, the wheels were already in motion. Later that afternoon, Ryan returned to the restaurant not as an undercover employee this time, but as the owner who had seen the truth firsthand. The staff was still adjusting to the change. Without Chris looming over them, the energy was different, but there was still uncertainty. Ryan knew trust wouldn't come overnight. Serena was at the prep station again, moving with focus, but when she saw him, she hesitated. He approached, rolling up his sleeves. "Mind if I jump in?" Ryan asked. She raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" Ryan grabbed a set of gloves. "Unless you'd rather I stand around giving orders." She let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Fine. Just don't slow us down." Ryan worked alongside her, listening more than talking. The employees gradually eased into conversation, and for the first time they weren't afraid to speak up. The cashier, a wiry teenager, muttered, "Never thought I'd see the owner making sandwiches." Ryan didn't stop moving. "You'll be seeing a lot more of it." And he meant it. This wasn't just about fixing one location. It was about making sure no store under his name operated the way this one had. As the shift went on, Serena finally spoke again, quieter this time. "I didn't think you'd actually come back." Ryan met her gaze. "I didn't come here to make promises I wouldn't keep." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Guess we'll see." And Ryan knew he would make sure they did.